So without controversy, the second chapter of Daniel is one of the most important books of the Bible, and for a couple of reasons. It's a remarkable prophetic overview of history. In fact, so prescient is it, so accurate, so clear in its forecast of the future, that it was said that by skeptics and critics that it could not have been written when it professes to have been written in the 5th century, 6th century BC, because it so clearly foretells the future that skeptics, critics said that's impossible. It must have been written way after the events happened and made to look like it was written before. But now scholarship has proven those criticisms and those skepticisms wrong. We know that the book was written in the 6th century BC. Archaeology and historical studies have neutralized that objection. And another reason that it is an important book of the Bible is it's a great story. It is simply a great, told in narrative form, it captures our attention with incredible drama and suspense. Now, before we dive in, there's something remarkable that our English translations of Daniel miss. In verse 4 here in chapter 2, Daniel switches from Hebrew, writing in Hebrew, to Aramaic. He switches to a different language, which Aramaic was the language of Babylon. He switches back to Hebrew in chapter 8. And the reason why is because from that point on, verse 4 through end of chapter 7, he's dealing with records and so on from the Babylonian system. And the Babylonians spoke Aramaic. It was the lingua franca of the world of that time. You know, lingua franca means the kind of the universal language, and it comes from that time when the French were the ones. It was French that was the kind of the universal language. Everybody wanted to know French because it was the language of diplomacy, it was the language of international trade, and so on, because the French had so many colonies all over the place. Of course, French isn't the lingua franca today. What's the lingua franca of today? English, far surpassing. It's the language of commerce, the language of trade, the language of diplomacy. Now, Daniel divides nicely into two halves. Chapters 1 through 6 are a fairly straightforward historical narrative. And then chapters 7 through 12 are Daniel's visions of the future. Chapter 1 introduces us to the major characters of the first half. And those major characters are the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. By the way, Nebuchadnezzar, when I'm writing my notes, I have to type that whole thing out. I probably should do a hotkey, right? I just press a hotkey and then N-E-B-U, and then on it goes. This is, by the way, this isn't Nebuchadnezzar the first. This is Nebuchadnezzar the second. There had been an earlier king named Nebuchadnezzar. This is the one, though, that took them to their zenith, to their golden age, Nebuchadnezzar the second. And so the first person that's a part of this story here in the first half is King Nebuchadnezzar, and then also Daniel, who you well know was a Jewish exile in Babylon. He had been raised to serve in Nebuchadnezzar's court as one of his royal advisors. And then, of course, the second half of the book expands on the flow of history that's set forth in chapters 2 through 7. Now, this is a little technical, but hang with me. Regarding chapters 2 through 7, there's an interesting design. They're a little bit like a mirror. Chapters 2 and 7 are visions of 4 world kingdoms set over against the kingdom of God. And so you got this idea of the world established by 4 kingdoms, mostly in terms of why are these 4 kingdoms picked? Well, because they had big influence on God's people, on Israel as a nation. And then the kingdom of God as opposed to those worldly kingdoms. That's chapters 2 and 7. And then chapters 3 and 6 are narratives of miraculous divine deliverances. And we saw one Sunday. Remember chapter 3, Daniel's 3 friends, where were they in the fiery what? Furnace. And God miraculously delivered them. And then the later chapter, chapter 6, is Daniel in the lion's den. So you see, you've got those kind of a mere story there. And then the central chapters 4 and 5, describes God's judgment of world rulers. Now, chapters 2, 3, and 4 are repeated in reverse order in chapters 5, 6, and 7. So it's just kind of an interesting way the book is designed. Now, we're used to reading books that follow a chronological order. A happens, and then B happens, and then C happens. We like a story that unfolds where we can follow what's going on. Don't you hate those movies that you're watching where the story goes along and then all of a sudden it just shifts to some other scene? You're like, wait, where does this fit? What was the name of that World War II movie that did that? It jumped over 3 different stories. Dunkirk? Is that what it was? You're watching this movie and you're following along, and then all of a sudden it just jumps to a completely different story in a completely different timeline. And you're like, wait, what? Don't do that to me, right? We like things in a nice, logical, tight, orderly timeline. If things bounce around, we get confused. With Daniel, while the narrative of chapters 1 through 6 follows a timeline, the visions that are related there are a progressive parallelism covering the same time period. And an analogy might help here. When we read a story, we like it to be like a straight stairway that leads gradually up, step by step, to the climax, right? So, you're introduced to this person and then to this person, and they do these things, and one thing follows after another. Lord of the Rings. It's very logical order to the story, right? Doesn't bounce around. You might move to different characters, but you get the sense the story's all kind of happening at the same time, and this is what happened to these people, and it all comes together at the end. The visions that we encounter in Daniel are more like a spiral staircase, which moves around the same point again and again. So you're walking up, you're kind of going around, but you see the central pole is the main story, and the higher you go, the more of the pole you see. You get the idea? So you kind of keep coming around to the same thing with different visions, different images, and it gives you a more complete picture. Each vision is another circuit that brings you to a higher vantage point, so you're able to get a better view. So that's Daniel, kind of more like a spiral staircase. Okay, so here we go. Verse 1. Now, in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dream. And so they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I've had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Now, this is, again, a little technical. Hang with me. The astute Bible student reads verse 1 and says, how can this only be Nebuchadnezzar's 2nd year? Chapter 1 has said that he's conquered Jerusalem, he's returned to Babylon, and do you remember from our study last time, how many years were Daniel and his friends in training? Do you remember how many years it was? 3 years. So how can this be only his Nebuchadnezzar's 2nd year? Well, this is where a little bit of history helps. Nebuchadnezzar's father, the Babylonian king Nabopolassar, again, love typing that one out, sent him out as the commander of Babylonian's military forces. So Nabopolassar, he's the Babylonian king, and he says to his son, the prince, the heir apparent to the throne, lead the armies out and go conquer. I'm the king, I'm going to stay home. And so that's what Nebuchadnezzar did. He's the one that led the armies out. He was a brilliant tactician. The Babylonians loved Nebuchadnezzar for it. And as Nabopolassar saw his reign coming to an end, his life drawing near, he made Nebuchadnezzar the designated heir and appointed him as co-regent. So he served as king before he was actually on the throne. So what we're seeing here is when he's the sole regent. It's the 2nd year of his sole regency. At this point, his dad has passed. Now, it was taken for granted that ancient Near Eastern kings received messages from the gods. After all, as kings, they were as close to the gods as humans could get. In fact, you might remember Pharaoh was worshipped as what? As a god, the living embodiment of a god. Well, Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, as the king of Babylon, were especially interesting because of his ambitious foreign policy. His victory over the Egyptians at the famous Battle of Carchemish had secured control of the eastern Mediterranean, and at this point, he's still laying plans for further conquests. But this dream that he has, it leaves him restless and troubled. Note that it says that he had dreams, not a dream, he had dreams, plural. It was the same dream over and over until he could no longer sleep. Have you ever had those kind of dreams? You might even have them in the same night. You have kind of a troubling dream, you wake up, oh man, and you go back to sleep, you have the same dream again. Your mind's working on something, right? So that's what's going on here. He summoned his advisors, those guys who were skilled in the so-called science of Babylon. Their science and their religion were all the same thing. These were the guys who were the ones who had been schooled in the occult arts, astrology, and most especially dream interpretation. Now think about this, right? These are his advisors, and the king is supposed to get dreams that are from the gods. So of course, he's going to need guys that can help him interpret those dreams. And that's what these guys were skilled in. So he brings them in. Watch this, verse 4. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king, and right here is where Daniel switches from Hebrew to Aramaic, right? Because what is he doing? He's quoting these guys that speak Aramaic. And here's what they say. O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. Sounds reasonable. That's the usual routine. He'd tell them the dream, then they'd interpret it for him by consulting their manuals. But Nebuchadnezzar's got another plan. Something about this dream is different. He knows that it's significant. He has to make sure he knows what it means. He said, I got to know the meaning of this dream. I keep having the same dream over and over again, and I know that there's a deeper meaning to it than just what I'm seeing in the dream. And so, verse 5, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. So the dream, again, it left such an impression on Nebuchadnezzar, he demanded assurance that the interpretation was legit. And the way to do that was by making these guys tell him what the dream was. He incentivized their doing so by saying that if they could tell him the dream and its interpretation, they'd be greatly rewarded. But if not, off with your heads. So again, these guys are trained. These are professional dream interpreters, a practice widely known in the ancient world. They had extensive manuals and lore on how to interpret dreams. But it was all presaged on knowing what the dream was, because it had been told to them. Nothing in their text told them how to guess what the dream was. Now think about it. These guys are the sum of the knowledge and the wisdom of mighty Babylon, the brain trust of the ancient world. Their job is to offer the king counsel by which he then runs the empire. Think of that. The lives and the well-being of millions of people rested on their skill as advisors. Nebuchadnezzar realizes this is a way for him to see if they had the wisdom they claimed to. He's a sharp guy. If he tells them the dream, they could say that it meant anything they wanted it to, right? And how does he know they're not giving an interpretation that enriches them? So he says, no, here's the way it's going to work. I know what the dream is. You tell me what the dream is so I know you have the ability to be able to interpret it. It's a sharp guy. How would Nebuchadnezzar know that these guys weren't making it up and it means something that furthered their plans, their goals? Okay, so they hear his challenge, but they can't believe it. And so they say, verse 7, they answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. Did you remember how he replied to them the first time? My decision is firm. And it's like they didn't hear that. What are they doing? Stalling for time, right? That's not the way it works, they say. You tell us, we interpret. Verse 8, the king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. Off with your heads. For if you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time is changed, in other words, till I've changed my mind, therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. So yeah, he knows they're stalling, hoping that if they can delay long enough, he'll change his mind, they'll wear him down. So he calls their bluff. It's very simple. Listen, deliver or die. Now, question, you were here Sunday, you heard the message. Does he have the power to pull this off? Right? Can he just say, okay, that's it, no more stalling, kill him? Yeah, he does. He has that power. He's the king of Babylon. Verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said. So they have to be respectful with Nebuchadnezzar, but they can't believe what he's demanding of them. They can't believe it. So a little bit of rebuke comes out now in their reply. They're trying to be respectful, but they're letting him know this is unreasonable. Look at what they say. There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. Right. That's correct. No man on earth can tell you what the dream was. That is absolutely correct. And no magician, no astrologer, or Chaldean can give the interpretation. But Daniel can, and that's where we're going. So these guys try to shame Nebuchadnezzar with the outrageousness of his demand. Without coming right out and saying it, they hint that he's being unreasonable, petty, and childish. Verse 11, it is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. But wait, hold on a minute. These guys claim to be in touch with those deities, right? That was the basis of their claim to special knowledge and wisdom. Their rituals were all about putting them in touch with the spiritual realm so they could get wisdom and counsel and advice from that realm and then pass it on to the king. Nebuchadnezzar simply tells them to get more knowledge than the dream's meaning. So why don't they get the dream first? Their response is, that's silly. But Nebuchadnezzar's got a point, and there's a lot at stake. The entire well-being of the empire. Verse 12, for this reason the king was angry and very furious and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And so the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men. And they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. So note Nebuchadnezzar's absolute power. He could give an order for execution of some of the court's highest and most powerful officials, and just like that, heads start rolling. What would happen if the United States president ordered his cabinet members executed? Or the Speaker of the House? You know, he turns to the Secret Service and he says, go whack the Speaker of the House. Are they going to do it? No. Some of you are like, I wish they would. Says, no, they're not going to do that. That's not going to happen. The president does not have that kind of power. The king of Babylon did. And that's going to come out in the story later. Well, chapter 1 showed the favor that Daniel and his friends enjoyed at court, and that pays off big now. Look at verse 14. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So the guy in charge of execution finds Daniel and his friends. Daniel asks, Arioch, what's going on? And interesting, isn't it? Arioch, instead of just lopping off his head, he explains. He tells them. Daniel persuaded Arioch to hold off and instead take him to the king. So you see what's going on here? Daniel has built up some goodwill with this guy. He's proven himself to be a man of integrity and honor and respect. And Arioch comes in. He's got an order from the king. And he probably, I don't want to kill Daniel. Arioch, what's going on? What is happening? There's blood dripping off your sword. What is happening here? Well, the wise men couldn't interpret. They couldn't tell the king his dream. And he sent the order, and we're killing all the wise men. Hold on. I wasn't a part of this. Go talk to the king. Verse 16. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time. What? That he might tell the king the interpretation. Interesting that the other wise guys hadn't done this. They hadn't asked for time to discover the dream, right? What did they say? That's impossible. And Daniel says, hold on, it is possible, but I'm going to need some time to get the dream. Can you give me some time? Those guys had assumed what Nebuchadnezzar demanded was impossible. Daniel knew that he was called to Babylon for more than to be cut down like this. He simply asked Nebuchadnezzar for time to pray and see if God would come through. It says something about the respect that Nebuchadnezzar had for Daniel that he consented to this because he'd already refused the other guy stalling for time. What's the point? I think you see the point. I think you understand the point. What have we been seeing? We saw it in chapter 1. We saw it again in chapter 3 on Sunday. That these men who are in a difficult place with unbelievers are respectful towards them. They're building up goodwill. They're not being defiant and angry, though they're in the midst of a system they utterly disagree with. Philosophically, religiously, it's an incredibly blasphemous, demonic system that they're in, and they're respectful towards people. And what does that do? That earns them some space to be used by God. I think that's a word for us. Because we live in a world that's becoming so partisan and so angry, where people are screaming at each other, and there's such an absence of respect and honor in our culture. I think it's important that when we find somebody that we disagree with, that we be careful about how we represent that difference. Build up some goodwill, because the day may come when that's going to serve you to be able to lead them to faith. Now, Daniel then, verse 17, went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. Of course, we know them by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning the secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. And so Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Well, I guess so, right? So Daniel goes home. He calls his friends to a prayer meeting. They ask God to do what only he could, reveal the dream and its meaning. And God answered their prayer. That night, Daniel had a dream, and he knew that it was the same as the king's. The next morning, Daniel rejoiced. He praised God. Verse 20, Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's demand." What Daniel says in praise of God was fresh revelation that was drawn from the dream and its meaning. Daniel knew from the theology that he'd been taught that He's wise and powerful. But now he knows from personal revelation that God is wise and powerful, because God has just come through for him in a really mighty way. Christian, don't be content to go to church or listen to podcasts or read books and learn about God from other people. Learn about God from God. Daniel knew these things to be true before he went to sleep that night. He knew that God is wise and powerful because he had been taught it. And he believed it. It was a truth that he held up here. But now that he's had this revelation from God, he knows it. He's experienced it. That reality of God, his power and his might. He's seen that God is the master. He's the Lord of history. Notice what it says there in verse 21. He, that is God, changes times and seasons. Empires do not rise and fall based on the strength of arms. They rise and fall at God's design, at his plan. Verse 21, it says, he removes and he raises kings. Friends, please hear me. Never forget Never forget that our God is on his throne. And everything is going to work out exactly as he has said. It's all going to work out. I know we listen to the news and we think, oh, the world is going to hell. Why doesn't God intervene? God is intervening. He's about to intervene in a really big way. Everything is going along just as he intends. Okay? So don't freak out. Don't worry. He's the master. He's the Lord of history. He raises kings. He removes kings. He changes times and seasons. That's at his hand and his command. And God gives wisdom to those wise enough to look to him for it. Notice what it says. He gives wisdom to the what? To the wise. Who here wants to be wise? Raise your hand if you want to be wise. Okay? Okay? Here's wisdom number one. Seek God. Okay? It's the wisest thing that you can do. You seek God, you'll get more wisdom. And that wisdom will teach you to seek God. Verse 24. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation. Now, this is interesting. This use of Arioch as a messenger seems unnecessary on Daniel's part. Why? He had already spoken to the king and obtained permission to prepare. So why doesn't Daniel go right back to Nebuchadnezzar? Why does he go to Arioch? He's doing the same thing. He's building up goodwill. You see, by going to Arioch, who had saved his life, had preserved his life, he's going to him and saying, okay, go tell the king that so there's somebody that can interpret it. Now, Arioch goes in, he's bringing Nebuchadnezzar what? Good news. It's going to elevate Arioch in Nebuchadnezzar's view. Because you never know. Daniel might need that guy again, right? You see, just wisdom. Daniel just shows so much wisdom right along the board in everything this man does. It's a brilliant play on his part. Interesting as well is Daniel's concern for the other advisors whose lives are now going to be spared. As we saw Sunday, some of those guys hated Daniel and his friends. They were jealous of them, and by the end of this chapter are going to be even more jealous of them. Daniel could have encouraged Arioch to carry out the sentence against the other court advisors while preserving only he and his 3 friends, but he doesn't. And you know why? Because he has God's heart and hopes that these guys can still be turned to faith in him. Verse 25. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, I found a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. Remember, that's his Babylonian name, Prince of Bel. Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the what? Later days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. So Daniel wanted Nebuchadnezzar to know that it wasn't his great skill that was able to pierce the veil of unknowing to discover Nebuchadnezzar's dream and its meaning. No, very simple. Listen, my God told me. He's the one that revealed it. He deflects all the glory where it belongs, back onto God. He wants to be clear, this is a dream of the future. It includes the whole scope of history right up to the end. As he says, your dream was this, we can be sure. Can you picture Daniel standing there, right? He's standing because that's what you do before Nebuchadnezzar's. Nebuchadnezzar's on a raised dais. He's sitting on his throne. Can you picture Nebuchadnezzar sitting there? Picture him sitting there. And Daniel says, okay, and the dream was this. What do you think Nebuchadnezzar does? Yeah, right? Puts his hand on his knee, yeah. He's eager to hear. Verse 29, as for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. So, isn't that interesting that Daniel doesn't start with the dream? He goes back before the dream and says, actually, before you fell asleep, you were thinking about the future. You're thinking about this great empire that you've built, and you started thinking, what comes next? How long is this going to last? That's kind of scary, right? You go to bed and you go to sleep and you have a dream. You wake up the next morning and you go to work and someone says, you had a dream last night, but before you went to sleep. You're like, what? Nebuchadnezzar is realizing that Daniel has been given knowledge that couldn't possibly come from anyone but God. His father, Nabopolassar, had defeated the Assyrians and had thrown off a 3-century-long yoke that the Assyrians had cast over Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar knew that before the Assyrians had thrown off the yoke, before they had thrown off the Assyrian yoke, the Assyrians had thrown off the Hittite yoke. He himself had recently defeated the 1,000-year-old empire of Egypt. And looking back, he realized that one empire ruled after another. And so he turns his gaze from looking back to looking forward. We're the latest in this long succession of empires, but we can't be the end. There's got to be something after us. What's coming next? God chose him, verse 30. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. Again, you see Daniel's humility here? It would be so easy for him to grandstand. Yes, I have the meaning of the dream. Let me tell you the dream. And then I'm going to tell you its interpretation because I am special. And these other guys, you should just get rid of them. No, he said, I'm not any better than those guys. It's not me. It's God. And our God doesn't want us to die. So that's why. Don't kill me. This is a perfect opportunity for Daniel to grandstand, claim special wisdom, but he doesn't. Okay, so now to the dream, verse 31. You, O king, were watching, and behold a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And you watched while a stone was cut without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a huge image in the shape of a man. It was made of 4 metals, each of decreasing value, decreasing worth, but increasing strength. Gold, silver, bronze, and iron. And then he saw an invisibly quarried stone rise, or it smashed the image in its feet. The image then toppled, shattered into fragments that became so fine they were blown away by the wind. And the stone then grew to replace, that became a huge mountain. It was a pretty corny, let's watch that again, because that's just delightful. That's fine PowerPoint making right there. That is truly, that takes skill. That was, okay. Wouldn't you have loved to have seen Nebuchadnezzar's face as Daniel was telling him, here's your dream? Because that was his dream. And he's told no one. So as he's hearing Daniel, this is it. This is the dream I had. You know what it's like when you have a dream, right? You have a dream, and when you first wake up, it's pretty clear. But have you noticed that just 2-3 hours later, it's already getting fuzzy and it's starting to go away? But there are some dreams that you kind of keep coming back to. You keep having the same dream over and over again. And it might be over years that you have kind of the same dream, and it sort of gets imprinted in there. Imagine somebody saying, you've had this dream many times over the years, and they start to just recount the dream to you. And here's what would happen, and I think you would probably be able to identify with this. There's stuff that you forget, but when you hear them describe your dream, yes, that's right. Oh, yeah. Wow. Because when you hear it, you're remembering now stuff that has become fuzzy, but they're explaining it. That's right. That's right. That was the song that was playing, or that's the color shirt that they were wearing, or whatever. So this is Daniel. He's describing this. Nebuchadnezzar is becoming increasingly freaked out by what he's hearing. And what does he know now? That when Daniel goes to the meaning, this has got to be the meaning. Why? Because he knows something that he couldn't know unless he had been told by God. As Daniel spoke, the king knew that God had revealed the dream to him and that he could then tell the interpretation. Verse 36. This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation, the meaning of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. So Daniel now sets the pattern for interpreting the dream. The different parts and metals correspond to different kingdoms. The Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar are the head of gold. God had given him a kingdom that covered the entire ancient Middle East. Under the Babylonian system, Nebuchadnezzar had absolute authority. And haven't we seen that? Go kill those guys. And they start dying. He's a tyrant in the truest sense of the word. His power is absolute, unfettered by any law outside of himself. This pure, unrestrained political power is what the gold represents. Verse 39. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all others. So, another kingdom, a second kingdom, will rise after the Babylonians. That's represented by the chest and arms of silver. It will be inferior to Babylon, as silver is inferior in value to gold. Now, if the next kingdom is inferior, how does it conquer Babylon? Right? Well, wait a minute. Babylon's the head of gold. Silver's inferior. Daniel says it's an inferior kingdom. Well, historically, it's politically inferior, but it's militarily stronger, just as silver is less valuable, but it's what? It's stronger than gold. Historically, the Persians were the next empire after Babylon to dominate the ancient Middle East. They were indeed stronger militarily, and politically they were weaker. Their rulers did not possess the absolute power of Babylonian kings. They were bound by laws that had already passed, as we'll see a little bit later in the book of Daniel. There's another story. Can I do a little parenthesis here to illustrate this? Do you all agree with me the king of Babylon has absolute power? Okay. But the Persian kings don't. How do we know that? Again, if a law had already been passed, even if they had passed it, they couldn't countermand it. We're going to see Daniel thrown into the lion's den. Why? Because the king, Darius, had passed a law that no one could pray to anybody but him. And Daniel, of course, prayed to the God of heaven. he was caught, and Darius couldn't countermand his own order. He had to let Daniel get thrown in the lion's den. Esther, in the Persian court. A law had been passed that the Jews could be persecuted on a certain day. She goes into her husband, the king. She's not able to get him to countermand the order because it's not the Persian system. Once the decree has been made, you can't countermand it. So what does the king do? He says to her, I can't stop this from happening. The law has been passed. But I'll give the Jews permission to what? Defend themselves. You see? You see how politically Babylon is, if you were, of greater value because the king has absolute authority, but under the Persians, their power is limited. Silver. But militarily, they're stronger. It's provocative that the Persians are represented by a chest and what of silver? Arms of silver. The two arms speak of the Persian Empire as an alliance of the Medes and the Persians, which their famous King Cyrus the Great forged into a union that conquered a huge swath of the ancient world, including Babylon. And that's why historians refer to it as the Medo-Persian Empire, represented in the image by the chest and the arms. Okay? So after the Persians, another kingdom would rise. Can you guys guess what that is? The belly and the thighs of bronze. What empire comes next in world history? It's the Greeks. Greece. Under Alexander the Great, who conquered not only the regions of Babylon and Persia, but all the way down into Egypt and into northwest India. To the ancient Middle Eastern mind, that comprised the extent of the borders of the known world. And so Daniel says there in verse 39, a third kingdom of bronze which shall rule over all the earth. Now, and this is interesting as well. Because you go, well, but it wasn't the whole earth. Yes, it went to northwest India and down in Egypt. What about the rest of Africa? What about the rest of Asia? Hold on. What happened to the culture of the world, even to this day, because of Alexander the Great's conquest? The Greek philosophy and Greek government has become the basis of all Western civilization, and Western civilization now has influenced the entire world today. Even in Asia, in places like China and Asia, Greek philosophy, Greek forms of government have gone literally around the world through modern media. As bronze is stronger than silver, the armies of Alexander were unstoppable. But bronze is of less value. So the political strength of the Greek system was weaker as well. The Greeks championed the idea of the city-state and democracy, which is ruled by the what? People, not the king. That system was wholly unsuited for the far-flung Greek Empire when the unifying strength of Alexander's leadership passed with his early death. And interesting, you have the Greek Empire, which goes out and conquers this huge swath of territory and fills it with Greek culture. And then Alexander dies, and then it just shatters. It just falls into four main regions for his four main generals that carved up the empire immediately after his death. But then there's a fourth empire represented by the legs of iron. Iron is the strongest metal yet and of the least value. Daniel says this fourth kingdom will dominate all that's gone before. It will stamp and press itself indelibly into them. That amply captures what Rome did to the entire Mediterranean world. It's an empire forged by iron. Rome's political form was a weak amalgam of Senate and Caesar. It was the political, not military weakness of Rome that caused her to fall in the 5th century. This fourth empire is represented by two legs, which is an apt picture of what happened during the days of Constantine when the Roman Empire split into the east and to the west. Now Daniel goes on with his explanation of the image, verse 41. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. So the description of the image ends at the feet, which is a mixture of iron and clay. Now, in keeping with the symbolism that's gone before, each part of the body and the metal that it's made of represents a new kingdom. The feet and the toes are linked somehow to the fourth kingdom, which we know historically is Rome, right? Because it's got what? What metal does it have in it? Iron. They're attached to the legs, and so they come after Rome, but they're made of iron, so they come out of Rome. They're mixed with clay, which Daniel says results in weakness. It's a weakness of division because iron and clay don't mix. There's no such thing as an iron-clay alloy, right? You can't mix those. There will be strength in this last iteration, represented by the iron, but it's also going to be fragile. Now, an important clue into what we're looking at is in verse 43. Look at what it says. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. Rome conquered many different people and ethnic groups. And though they never coalesced into a united whole, they did take on many features, these people that they conquered, of the Roman system. Throughout the Middle Ages, as Rome's old imperial system dissolved, the people groups of the Roman Empire banded together to form nations. Those nations are pretty much what we see across Europe and Western Asia today. During the Middle Ages, several Europeans tried to resurrect Rome. You guys might remember some of these names from your high school history courses. Charlemagne, Frederick Barbarossa, Carlos V, Charles the Great, same guy. Do you remember? They were called the Holy, what? Roman Emperor. Not a Roman emperor. Charlemagne was the first of these guys, and he was in the very beginning of the 9th century. In fact, it was on Christmas Day of 800 AD that he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. It was an attempt to resurrect Rome, you see, in Europe. Try as they might, Rome would not rise from the ashes. Rome never was replaced by another empire, was it? It never was. Babylon was replaced by Persia. Persia was replaced by Greece. Greece was replaced by Rome. Who replaced Rome? It was called the Dark Ages. It just all fell apart and slowly came back to what? Nations, nation states, all divided. Nebuchadnezzar's dream suggests some form or manifestation of Rome will rise again in the end times to be crushed by Jesus when he returns to set up the kingdom of God on earth. He is that stone that's cut without hands that smashes the image in the feet. That image which represents earthly empires, right? When Jesus comes, they will fall and be blown away, and then his kingdom will fill the earth. Hallelujah. Now, many students of Scripture and prophecy watchers regard the emergence of the European Union as a rebirth of Rome. The nations that comprise the EU are the territory that the Roman Empire once ruled. And much of what the European Union has done has been a conscious attempt to align with the hegemony that Rome once held over Europe and Western Asia. The independent nations and states of the EU have formed a European Parliament. I'm sure you know this. They have elected an executive council to address what? The political weakness their separate sovereignties bring with them. Most member EU nations have converted their national currency to the euro because they know there won't be a real European unity until their economies merge. There's a European passport that's good for all 27 EU nations as their borders between those European nations really move from being borders that you used to have to cross to just lines you drive across now. I've been to Europe. I've driven across those borders. There's not even any checkpoints anymore. You just drive across the border. Oh, we're in Prague, or we're in the Czech Republic now. You know, we used to be in Germany, and you don't even know you've crossed a line. Those used to be guarded borders. You couldn't get across unless going through a lot of rigmarole to get through them. So here's the question. Is the European Union a fulfillment of the feet and the toes of iron and clay in Nebuchadnezzar's dream? And the answer is it could be. NATO is militarily super powerful. Iron, right? But clay, it's politically highly fragmented still. In fact, we saw a big setback to the EU not long ago when England said, we're out. Remember Brexit? They were a part of the EU, and they had this popular vote, and they pulled out. So we'll see what happens. Politically, they're weak. But just recently, isn't it interesting that you had a couple of European nations who were clamoring to get into NATO because of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine? Sweden and Finland were not a part of NATO. And when they saw Russia invade Ukraine, they applied to, and they said, please let us into NATO. So we're seeing this interesting reassessment of the political situation in Europe in light of this threat that they see from Russia. Now note what Daniel says about these feet and toes of mixed iron and clay, verse 44. And in the days of what? Say it. And in the days of what? These kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. So keeping with the image and how it's panned out in history, the toes speak of several smaller rulers and nations. These kings. For years, Bible prophecy students have seen the European Union as the potential fulfillment of this prophecy. And they've made much of the toes and suggest that 10 toes point to 10 member EU states. And that was great when there were 8. And then there were 9. And Bible students were like, what's going to be the 10th nation? And when it comes, it's the end. Jesus is going to come back. And then there was 10. And they were like, and then there were 11. And now there's 27. So, does the 10 toes mean 10 nations, or just does it mean a bunch? Could it just mean a bunch? Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that the silver chest and arms, the 2 arms referred to Medo-Persia, and the legs referred to Rome, east and west. So the numbers may mean something there. It's probably best to understand the 10 toes as 10 specific European nations. Listen, while there are 27 EU member states, they don't all have the same status. There are 10 central members and only 10. The way that the EU is set up, there can only be 10 central members, core members. There's 17 what are called associated, observer, and partner nations. Here's what we're to take note of. Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that God gave him a vision, it says, of the later days. It's not the metallic image that's the focal point of the dream. It's what comes next and what happens to the image that's important. Verse 44, and in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that stone was cut out of the mountains without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God of heaven, or the great God, has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. So the image and the reign of human empires that it represents comes to an end when the stone replaces it. And we're to understand the stone as a cornerstone. The image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream represents human empires that ruled the Middle East and specifically had hegemony over the land of Israel. The stone that's cut without hands is Christ, called both the Old and the New Testament the chief cornerstone. The stone of stumbling, the rock of offense, who becomes the foundation of the church and the kingdom of God. It's in the days of the feet and the toes, the old Roman Empire in revived form, that Christ comes, brings an end to mere human rule and establishes the reign of God over all the earth. Now verse 46, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, "Truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal the secret." Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole prince of Babylon and chief administrator over the wise men of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is what we'd have to call mercurial. He's fickle. You know, off with their heads, and then promote this guy. Yeah. Put everything under him. Daniel has demonstrated otherworldly wisdom, and so Nebuchadnezzar promotes him to be the governor of the home province of Babylon. And Daniel knew who his friends were, those guys that he had gone home to and said, "Pray with me." And they had had that prayer meeting. He knew them to be skilled administrators and men of sterling integrity, and so he asked Nebuchadnezzar to promote them as assistants. Verse 49, also Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So if we didn't know history, we might think that Daniel gets this promotion, and as soon as he gets the promotion, he says to Nebuchadnezzar, "Hey, can you promote my friends to these positions?" And they become administrators, and then Daniel's sitting in the gate. And if we didn't know history and what that meant, we might think that Daniel gets promoted and immediately assigns his task to them, and then he goes sits on a beach somewhere. That's not what sitting in the gate means. We think of a gate, and it's just an opening in a fence. The gate of the ancient city was the place of authority. You have a wall around a city to protect it, and the only way you can get into the city is through the gate. And you can only get in through the gate if they let you. The gates aren't just this place that everybody can walk in or out. It's guarded. It's a place of authority. The rulers of the city have established a gate guard that are there full time, and they're checking people's identification. Some people come up and they go, "Can I come into the city?" "Well, who are you? And what business are you going to do here?" And so you're allowed in or you're allowed out. So the gate becomes a picture of authority. And so it becomes then, as this picture of authority, the place where the city leaders would sit during the daytime, and anybody that had a grievance would go to the city gate, and typically there'd be a line, and they would stand there and they would talk to an assistant and say, "I'm having a dispute with my neighbor about this or that." And then that person would take it to one of the judges and say, "This guy over here, he's got a problem with this. Do you guys want to hear this case or not?" And they would say yes or no. If yes, then the guy would present his case to the city leaders and they would make a ruling. So Daniel is the governor of the province of Babylon. What's he doing? He's sitting in the gate, not the gate of the city of Babylon. Where's he sitting? He's sitting at the gate to Nebuchadnezzar's palace. Anybody that wants to see the king has to talk to Daniel, you see. He's his agent. And he becomes the supervisor for all the wise men. So you understand now why these guys, these old school guys, who he's shown up, hate him. Because he was the nobody before. Now he's been promoted to be their boss. So they want to get rid of Daniel, Shadrach, Abednego. They want to get rid of these guys. We see the jealousy that's there. So, as we end, remember what we looked at Sunday in the next chapter. You guys tell me, as we wrap up, what does Nebuchadnezzar make? What does he make? He makes a big what? Gold image. Does he make an image of gold, silver, bronze, and iron? What does he make? A big gold image. Do you see what he's doing? Because who does the gold head represent? Him. You see what he's doing? Some time's gone by. He's thinking about all this. Yeah, we rose after the Assyrians, but you know what? I think we're it. It's Babylon forever. Yeah, and what he's doing is he's just losing his grip. And so he's going to make this image, it's all gold. And it's 100 feet tall. And everybody's got to worship it. What's he just done? He's acknowledged that who's the real God? Daniel's God. And so he makes this image, and he gets all furious because these three guys won't worship it, and he throws them in a fiery furnace and then has a huge reversal. Right? Oh, no, you're God. No other God can do this, what your God has done for you in delivering you from the fiery furnace. Anybody that says anything bad about their God, off with his head. And then we have chapter 4, which we'll look at Sunday. Because it just keeps playing on that whole theme.